evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Both this evening and next week, it is our privilege to welcome to our program Robert Ellis Smith from Washington, D.C. Mr. Smith is a journalist and a lawyer, as I've indicated, from Washington, D.C. Mr. Smith is a frequent speaker, writer, and congressional witness on privacy issues in America and has compiled a clearinghouse of information that specifically deals with computer data banks, wiretaps, lie detectors, law of privacy, psychological and physical privacy, and the question of free press and privacy. Since 1974, Mr. Smith has published the Privacy Journal. Prior to that time, he was a former assistant director of the Office for Civil Rights in the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, holding that position from 1970 to 1973. He is also a former assistant director of the Privacy Project of the American Civil Liberties Union. During these two broadcasts, it is going to be our intention to discuss with you in great detail as a viewing audience, or allow you to hear our expert on the question of constitutional issues in relation to your privacy and the question of business and government and others' invasion of that privacy. Mr. Smith, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Joining with me in questioning our guest this evening and again next week will be my panel. Included on that panel is Mr. Richard Snyder, an anthropologist teaching at North Idaho College. He's been with us several times before, and welcome once again, Richard.
Thank you, Tony. I'm glad to be here.
And a regular panelist, Mary Lou Reed, holding a baccalaureate from Mills College in California, did her graduate work in theology at Columbia University. As always, Lou, welcome.
Thank you once again, Tony.
And it's also a pleasure to welcome back to our program a regular panelist, but has not been with us for some time, Dr. Ken Wright, teaching in the field of chemistry. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Tony. It's nice to be back.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series will come from Richard Snyder.
Mr. Smith, may I call you Bob?
By all means.
Okay, Bob. First thing that comes to my mind is why all the concern about privacy?
Well, I think privacy is a natural yearning among people. It's elbow room to grow, and I think it's uniquely an American need, as a matter of fact. I think we are more interested in privacy than others. And it's been especially threatened, I think, by the introduction of computers, in short. The very quick nature of computing, the aspect of the fact that computer records can be retrieved at long distances and that masses of information can be stored at very little cost, have really changed the whole equation so that there's all sorts of private information, sensitive information about us kept by strangers.
Can you give me an example or two of the sorts of information that might be stored, say, about you or about me?
Well, bank records, for instance. In former days, I would write out a check that might tell something about me. It would tell a doctor that I had, or that a publication that I subscribed to, or a cause that I supported, or a relative to whom I loaned money. And that would come back in my bank statement, and there would be no invasion of privacy. That information would be returned to me. Now those checks are microfilmed, the front and back of them each, and stored for 5 years by every bank in the land. And that is possible cheaply only because of the technology.
And if I hear you right, then you're telling me that every check I've written for the past 5 years is stored someplace on microfilm, and not just the amount, pardon me, but who I wrote the check to and the date and the whole thing.
Exactly. It's a photocopy of the front and back of the check, and every check that's deposited into your account as well. So photocopies of all your payroll checks. This is required by federal law. It's been required for about the last 8 years, and very few people really realize it. Think of what a tempting library of information that is.
Well, do you have any idea why the federal government would require that kind of information?
Well, to combat white-collar crime, really, to try to provide a means to investigate fraud and other organized crime.
So there's a general blanket idea that there's some sort of crime going on, so we're going to keep records on everyone.
Exactly. I think it's part of the mania of what I call information overkill. Any problem now is addressed first with a new way of collecting information about it. I don't think we hit the problem head on. We decide we're going to collect a whole lot of information about it.
I want to go one step farther, and then I'll pass this on. What about the concept of a Social Security number being a kind of national identity number? How would that play into this?
I've devoted a good deal of attention to that because I think that it would be the one way for all of these different computer systems to link up. I think everybody realizes that when you do business with a government agency or a business, you have to give up a certain amount of information about yourself. But what we don't bargain for is that all of that information would be pooled and would be linked. And if each of those data banks has our Social Security number, as just about all of them do, then the link up becomes much easier. It cuts down on duplication, and numerical link up seems to lend itself more to automatic data processing than a name link up.
Lou Reed.
Would you talk a little bit more about some of the possible misuses of this computerized information? Who's going to perhaps get a hold of this confidential information and use it against the individual?
Well, we saw during the Watergate era some great abuses. The use of Internal Revenue Service information for purposes other than tax administration. The White House plumbers found out that Daniel Ellsberg had a psychiatrist in the first place through his bank account, through a check that he had written. That was the means to find out. So we are aware of the Watergate abuses. I think we're less aware of the abuses in the commercial sector. One of the traditional views of privacy is that information about me, even if it's not particularly sensitive, like my face, for instance, I am entitled to own. It's my persona. And if somebody else were to use it, and in a commercial sense, if somebody were to snap my picture right now, let's say all of our pictures right now, and say 4 out of 5 people at the North Idaho campus, let's say, use these particular pads. Well, that's an invasion of privacy, even though it's in a public meeting where this picture was taken, simply because we've been ripped off. And I think that many of the invasions of privacy in the commercial sector are of that type. They are our name and address on a mailing list, for instance, which may not be particularly sensitive, but we have been ripped off because somebody else is making money on that information about us.
Because they're selling the mailing lists, and
Yes.
we have not given our permission to do so.
Yes.
Is there something also about the fact that since information is power, any information that you are giving up about yourself is also perhaps giving up some freedoms and some power? Is this part of your personal belief?
Well, I think with regard to institutions, it certainly is. Part of the mania for information collection, I think, is a power grab. Bureaucrats feel more comfortable if they know every possible fact about their situation or the people involved in their program. And I think that's a large measure of it. I hadn't thought about the opposite of that, which is if they're getting power through personal information about me, that means I'm losing power.
You're possibly losing some options.
Yeah,
some
definitely.
freedoms.
Yeah, I certainly am. I mean, I understand the need for credit bureau, for instance, but the more they know about me and say it's derogatory, then the less freedom I have to shop. That's what.
How about if your health isn't too good and they find out, your insurance company finds this out, finds the confidential records? Is this something too that is a hazard? The sharing of information that really is confidential through this computerized system?
Very definitely. We've had this tradition of medical confidentiality for a long time, but it's really been eroded now, not just because of computers, but because of the insurance relationship, so that records about me in my doctor's office now have to be shared with the insurance company, so that is a further erosion of privacy.
Ken Wright.
Since we've been discussing invasion of privacy, I'd like to invade yours for a second here, Bob. I'm curious about your background.
It is a curious background, I guess.
Well, how do you make your living now, actually? Do you practice law?
No, I don't. I have a law degree, and I've handled a couple of cases, but very few. I publish a newsletter, and for the last 4 years, I have supported myself with a newsletter that is sold by subscriptions.
You were at one time, of course, working for the government in the health, education, and welfare in the, let's see, what
Civil
department?
Rights
Civil
Office,
Rights
yeah.
Office, right. And so you've obviously been a champion of human rights in the past in one form or another. I suppose that's what caused you to start the privacy journal that you did.
That's right. I have had an interest in civil rights and civil liberties for a long time, and both in my law studies and when I was a newspaper reporter, I was always interested in the tension between the free press and the right to privacy. And that's really how I got into this.
If my arithmetic is right, you got your law degree about age 34. Why law school at that particular time?
Well, lots of reasons. I was surrounded by lawyers when I grew up. My father and my brother-in-law and all my roommates in college, and maybe it was self-defense. I don't know. I also thought it was a way to bring about social change. I'm sort of a product of the Ralph Nader influence. When I was in Washington, he really led everybody to believe that if you were a socially conscious lawyer, you could change the world. And I think that had a lot to do with it. I thought it was a means of social reform.
But right now, you don't anticipate going back into law. It sounds like you're pretty well settled on a
yes, because
program of publishing. And
yes, I am. I think first and last a journalist who reports about legal issues. Yeah.
Mr. Smith, we want to get back to the question of technical advancements that invade privacy, and that is your purpose for being on our campus to deal with that during the Convocations Week. I noticed in some literature that I had that in the last 25 years, the power of a whole room full of computer gear, which is a very large room, has been changed through technology to where you can squeeze all of that very large room full of storage information on now to a chip within a computer that's about the size of a postage stamp. That we, in 25 years, have really created the technical ability to store such huge amounts of data. Is this, in relation to what you've already talked about today, another reason why that citizens may be partially losing the battle over the question of privacy? How can you keep up with constitutional protections in a technical age that has given this kind of information to so many different organizations and institutions?
Yeah, I agree with one footnote, but not only are the machines much smaller, they're much cheaper, and that has amazing implications, I think, because there are virtually no limits to the storage capacities of these machines, and that means there are no deterrents. So, when in doubt, the bureaucrat will gather the personal information instead of questioning whether it's effective, whether it's cost effective, let's say. You mentioned, though, the trend of smaller computers getting into the hands of individual citizens, and I think that's a very good trend. It's called hobby computing or personal computing. Radio Shack, for instance, among other chains around the country, will sell a personal computer for $600-700. And I think that part of the reason we're in the fix we're in now is because computers have been a great mystery to us. And I think that the more of us who have these machines in our homes and can use them, perhaps taught by our kids, not by ourselves, how to use them, that'll demystify the machines, and we'll be more in an equal bargaining position with institutions that have this massive computer power.
Richard Snyder.
I vaguely remember from a year ago, 6 months ago, something like that, newspapers and televisions covering something about very, very large international computers. I think mention was made of one or two of these being in Switzerland that were just accumulating information from all over the world and storing information out of the country. And can you tell me anything about this at all?
I think it's false. It began with some church group that a fundamentalist sect, I believe, circulated that story, that there was, somewhere in Western Europe, this massive computer data bank that was gathering all sorts of information about us. From time to time, we have proposals in Washington for a national data center. That really is what prompted the citizen concern about this issue. It just seems more efficient to have under one roof all of the personal data about everybody in computers. And it's proposed from time to time. But I would not say that there's any place in the Western world, should we say, anywhere, I think, where all facts about everybody are kept in one system.
Well, isn't a certain amount of this invasion of privacy by storage of information on computers and that kind of thing, and this may amuse you, but I'm going to throw it out anyhow, the magic phrase national defense. Now, doesn't that justify doing all or at least some of what's being done?
No, I don't think so. Of course, that term's been abused so much, but I don't see, in the name of national defense, why it's any more of a justification to gather all that information about people than some other national goals. I think much stronger, much compelling reasons would be law enforcement in the nation, or efficiency, or saving taxpayers dollars, or even conserving space. I mean, if we want to conserve space, we ought to all live together and have less privacy. So those are more compelling competing goals than the one of national defense, I think.
Well, can you tell me some of the kinds of data that's being passed from computer to computer? Because I think you said earlier that computers were linking up. Not that it's a computer conspiracy and they're doing something they're going to take over the world, but apparently if one has my Social Security number and another does, it is possible to hook them up and share information.
That's true.
What sorts of information would be passed back and forth?
Well, credit bureaus used to work either by mail or telephone to all the department stores and all the national credit card companies. Now that's a direct computer link back and forth. A used car salesman down the street would have a computer terminal in his showroom that would give him direct 24-hour instantaneous access to the credit bureau. In just about every state capital, the major insurance companies have direct computer access to the Department of Motor Vehicle files. The auto insurers do. All of the life insurance companies are linked together with a data bank called the Medical Information Bureau in Boston, so that they can query that system to see whether an applicant has had a particularly bad medical history with another insurance company. There are private insurance companies who do some of the administration of the Medicare program. They have computer links directly into the Social Security computer network. Part of what we've done, as you can see, is we've blurred the line between public and private in this area too, which I think is dangerous.
And finally, for this sort of round, I see two possibilities. One, and there certainly may be a third or fourth, one is that all of this is taking place because of tremendous advancements in the technology of computers. And secondly, or as an alternative to that, increasing numbers of people have brought about a need to deal with them in this way. In other words, there's an enormous number of people in the United States now as compared to 20 years ago, 40 years ago. What would you go with?
I think that's valid. We never would have had computer development, I think, without the need of both the Census Bureau and the Social Security Administration to process forms about people. They couldn't have done their jobs without automation. And an awful lot of computerization was developed in those two agencies. There were other trends that came along, too. The New Deal and the Great Society programs meant that government had a much bigger role in people's lives, and they had to gather information to see whether we qualified for programs. And then there was great hue and cry that much of the money was not going to the right people, so they had to gather more information about us to see who was eligible and whether the money was going to the right people. And then some significant other factors, I think, that came along at the very same time as automation. The growth of insurance in our lives. I think 85% of all medical bills now are paid with insurance, and whoever's paying the bill wants to know all about the condition, obviously. Just about everybody who's got any sense has auto insurance now, and that hasn't always been true. Also, more than 50% of all purchases are on credit now, so that involves more information gathering. And at the same time came another trend, which was a mobility in American society. More than half of us now do not live in our own hometown, so we're not known to the merchant down the street. You know, the guy who runs the department store can't say, well, he's unemployed, but I know his family and he's good for the bills and all that. Or he drinks a little bit, but he comes from a good stock. You know, they can't do that anymore. They have to consult a stranger, the credit bureau, to find out whether we're good for the money.
Lou Reed.
Would you agree with Vance Packard that another reason is our sheer affluence and abundance, that advertising and consumption and the fact that people are purchasing has really contributed to, and the expansion of credit, which of course is expansion of money, has contributed to this whole
Yeah, it has.
syndrome.
Partly because I think we're careless consumers. We have enough money not to have to really shop around and think twice about the information that's being gathered. If we want to buy a car or a piece of furniture on time, we'll give up the information because we're sort of, I think, kind of sloppy consumers.
Is it also true that Americans like to fill out forms and that we do like to give information about ourselves and that we're not
Yeah, I think so.
particularly... Now, why do you think that's true?
I think we're both more conscious of our privacy and more curious and sort of more trusting about filling out those forms. You ask why? I think it starts at school. I think that when we're in the lower grades, you know, we get all these forms put in front of us. They're fun to fill out, first of all. Sort of flattering to be asked, you know, what your age is and what your mother's name
Somebody
is.
cares.
Yeah. And also, we don't know which is required and which is voluntary because the teacher puts it in front of us and we assume we have to fill out everything. And then I think in our adult life, the commercial and governmental agencies sort of take advantage of that vulnerability. They know that anything that is put in front of us will fill out, and we don't distinguish as to whether the information is required or voluntary. We'll just fill it out.
We also probably don't know what information can be used for us or against us. Is that possibly true?
Exactly.
Yeah,
because
that
most
our
of it
mailing,
seems innocuous. Most of it seems very innocuous, and we don't know that very innocuous information in one context could be used to haunt us, you know, in a different context.
Would you advise people to be more careful about filling out forms and about giving out personal information?
Definitely, yeah. In two ways. One, assume that it's going to become part of a network of information exchange. And many people will still give it up. They won't object to that, but other people will stop and think. And secondly, try to shop around in advance so that you fill out the form with a minimal amount of personal information, and perhaps it gets bounced back. You fill it out with maybe give them a little more and see if it works that time. And I've done that, and I found that quite often you can still get the benefit by not, even if you don't fill out the form totally.
By not disclosing as much as they ask,
Yes.
just sufficient for their
Because a
immediate
lot of that information that's being asked is for their marketing purposes or for other reasons that are not directly tied to the benefit, whether it's a driver's license or insurance or whatever.
Ken Wright.
Bob, I get the distinct feeling that you feel that one of the abuses of computers has been in the area of business, probing too far into your personal life and having too much information. Where is the Better Business Bureau, which has always been sort of in the everyday person's mind the safeguard, you know, on the outfit you check with if business was bad? Where do they fit in this picture of?
Well, many people don't realize that the Better Business Bureau is supported by the businesses in town, and their responsibility and motivation is to make sure that individual businesses don't mistreat consumers and thereby give everybody a bad name. So that if there were information exchanges going on that affected the business community as a whole, which is what I'm talking about really, the credit field, I don't think the Better Business Bureau, you know, would object to it. I think that they would be on the side of the business community as a whole. You've touched on another problem, though. There is no real watchdog in this area. You know, the consumer advocates seem to be interested in other things in this particular thing. It's hard to focus attention on this issue.
It sounds like maybe your organization or your journal is maybe the watchguard.
Yeah, I've sort of jumped into that breach, but I think that mainly it's something that individuals have to do. It would be extremely ironic if we had a huge organization looking after people's individual privacy. So, you know, essentially it's got to be the individual's responsibility.
Well, can you summarize what you think some of the legitimate uses of computer information on individuals by business would be? So where does the line, you know, where do you draw the line on credit history and?
That's a hard question. I think if credit histories are accurate, which I'm not convinced they are, but if they were accurate, I think they serve a purpose, sure. I mean, I think it's legitimate that a merchant should have that information as long as it's accurate. I think that a lot of the really gossip that's gathered for insurance companies is inappropriate. I think government could do with a lot less information on people, but I can understand the need for basic information about, well, it depends on the benefit, but I can understand the need to establish basic information for eligibility purposes.
Well, in the private sector, do you feel that that businesses should not be allowed to exchange their computerized information?
Well, as a rule of thumb, yes, I can see some exceptions to that, but generally, the principle is it's been developed by several study groups, and it's now part of the law too in certain aspects, is information gathered for one purpose about me ought not to be used for a secondary purpose without getting my consent. So if I give you information to establish a credit history at my department store, that's okay to exchange that with the auto dealer because that's to establish whether I am entitled to credit. It would be inappropriate to determine whether I'm entitled to a job or to particular housing or to turn it over to a political opponent of mine or something like that. That's a different purpose That's not why I gave the information in the first place, so you should have to come back to me and get my consent for that use.
Okay, the law you talk about, I assume, must be the Freedom of Information Act, isn't it?
Well, it's sort of the twin of that, the Privacy Act that applies to federal government records, and it applies that principle to federal records.
What's your, Tony?
Yes, I was going to interject here a question in relation to what you're saying, Ken. Both the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act of 1974, many people are aware of those, have been publicized. And is it not true that the citizens may be under the false impression that those two acts would cover all actions within the society and protect them? Two-part question. What are some of the loopholes within those federal laws? And secondly, it is my understanding that when you deal with certain matters that are state matters, not federal, that obviously there are states that do not have similar acts on the state level, and therefore we could have a problem. Would you make some comments on that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. We should be clear that both those acts you mentioned apply to federal records, and they generally are access laws. The Privacy Act gives me a right of access to personal information held on me by federal agencies. 9 states, including California, have their own privacy acts at the state level. None in the Northwest United States do. So that you're right. Also, another misconception is that the Privacy Act somehow applies to the private sector and gives you certain rights to privacy when you're dealing with a private company.
When you deal with the Privacy Act of 1974 at the federal level, however, aren't there certain provisions within that law that exclude a number of very significant federal agencies in how they have to deal with individuals and records, and what they have to reveal that they have on individuals? I know in reading some of the provisions of the Act, when you talk about the CIA or the FBI and some other agencies, that the Privacy Act is not as extensive as it might first appear. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, that is true. The CIA is exempt from many of these provisions, especially when national security is involved. The FBI would be exempt where there is an ongoing investigation, but if you feel that you're a subject of an FBI file that, say, is 5 years old and dormant, then you are entitled to see it and to be told what's in the file, and we should point out to correct it if it's wrong.
I just wanted to get that point clear, too, that the purpose of those laws, is it not correct, that are to give an individual a chance to prove information wrong, and if it is wrong, that it does have to be removed from the file if it's proven beyond a question of doubt that it was false information.
Yes, to do that, and also to discourage exchanges of personal data among federal agencies. It has those two aspects to it.
Right. With that, I'm going to have to bring our program to conclusion. We're out of time, but Bob, we'll look forward to having you with us again next week, and we'll continue to discuss some other questions concerning the protection of privacy for citizens of this country. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I also express my appreciation of the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week when our guest again will be Mr. Smith, when we will discuss this whole question of the Constitution and your right to privacy. Until that time, this is your moderator, Tony Stewart, wishing you a good week and a good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. To the campus of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
This week, we want to continue our discussion with journalist lawyer Robert Ellis Smith from Washington, D.C. Mr. Smith is a frequent speaker, writer, and congressional witness on the issue of privacy in the United States and has compiled a clearinghouse of information on such subjects as computer data banks, wiretaps, lie detectors, law of privacy, psychological and physical privacy, and the free press and privacy. Since 1974, our guest has published the Privacy Journal. Prior to that time, he was the former Assistant Director of the Office for Civil Rights in the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, holding that position from 1970 through 1973. He is also a former Assistant Director of the Privacy Project of the American Civil Liberties Union. He has a recently published book entitled Privacy. Welcome back to our program, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Also, it's my pleasure to welcome back our panel for this week to continue the discussion. First of all is Richard Snyder in the field of anthropology and a member of the faculty at North Idaho College. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here again.
Also, regular panelist Mary Lou Reed, holding a baccalaureate from Mills College in California and did her graduate work in religion at Columbia University. Welcome once again, Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
And also regular panelist Dr. Ken Wright, holding a PhD in the field of chemistry and teaching at North Idaho College. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Tony.
We'll continue the questioning, and the first series of questions will come from Richard Snyder.
Bob, do you know of any groups that have been formed or businesses that have been formed solely for the purpose of prying into our information, for commercial purposes? Are there businesses that an insurance company can subscribe to, and this company will go out and make a dossier on people or something along that line?
Precisely. The field is called consumer reports, consumer investigations, and it's really dominated by one company called Equifax, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia. And for $6 or $10, they will do a very cursory report of a applicant for insurance or an applicant for a job, quite often interviewing neighbors or co-workers. Try to find out what they call life habits, smoking habits, drinking habits, driving habits, the way you rear your children, that sort of thing. I think they're of doubtful use, but insurance underwriters say that they do use these reports. So that is an example, yes, of a company that whose sole purpose really is to gather subjective information about people. They would not call it gossip, but I call it gossip. They gather gossip, I think.
In your estimation, whether it's objective or gossip, what do you suppose the accuracy of reports like that are? I mean, for $6 or $8?
Well, exactly. It doesn't even deserve the name investigation. And there have been congressional and Federal Trade Commission studies of this company and their few competitors showing, for instance, that the average duration of an employee is about 4 or 5 years. The educational level is not high. These are people generally who are trying to work their way through either higher education or they're on their way to some other form of employment. They are not really trained in their business. There also have been allegations that there is a bounty for derogatory information, that the management feels that you could expect a certain quota, really, of derogatory information would come up in the average week or month, and so that any employee who doesn't meet that quota is thought to be not really a prime candidate for promotion.
Do you know of any cases in which just the opposite of this situation is true, where consumers are prying into the privacy of businesses and governments?
One columnist in Washington said, we shouldn't worry so much because we know more about them than they know about us. And I think that's true of our relationship with the federal government since the Watergate era. We do know more about them than they know about us. I really think so. They have a lot of facts about us on file, but they don't use it effectively. There's too much for them to absorb and to use. And there are lots of watchdog agencies along these lines, most of them keeping an eye on the FBI, on the CIA, and organizations that have investigatory powers themselves. There's a lot of that. I don't see so much in the way of watchdog agencies over the private sector.
And finally, for this time around, what do you suppose all this is costing the consumer? Now, we've got insurance companies with massive computers, and they're linking up with each other, and no company is paying for this. Somehow it's being funneled right on to the people that use the company's services or goods. How much do you suppose we're paying for all of this spying on us?
Well, in terms of government spying, we're paying an awful lot. I mean, a whole lot of taxpayer money just goes down the drain with this information overkill. And I'll tell you, to add insult to injury, we, the taxpayers, are paying the legal fees to defend those of the Nixon administration who are accused of invading people's privacy. It's ironic, I think, that tax money is being used for their defense fees. With regard to the private sector, the insurance business would say that if they didn't have these sorts of reports, investigations, then the incidence of fraud obviously would increase a whole lot. So they say that this sort of investigation is saving us all money. I really have my doubts. I just don't think that those reports are worth the paper they're written on, and that insurance underwriting is much more sophisticated now, and I think could be done without all that subjective reporting.
Lou Reed.
Bob, would you talk some more about the problems of compiling all this inaccurate information? What are the hazards involved in dissemination of unevaluated information, whether it's disseminated or not, just the compilation of information that may or may not be accurate and nobody knows?
Well, it certainly cheapens the currency of information. It means that even accurate information is not as valuable because it has less credibility. Maybe that's in our interest, I don't know, but I think that's one impact of it. But inaccurate information can have very real consequences for individual people. The loss of a job is a common one. Somebody is mistakenly referred to, I remember this as an actual case, it was referred to as a hippie type. And the closest he came to being a hippie was that he had a Volkswagen bus, and he had children who wore jeans, but he was really an upstanding citizen. He lost his job on the basis of that kind of a report. So it can mean very real damages to people.
Are there any protections at this point against misinformation, inaccuracy?
There are some. The right to privacy is recognized in the court, so you could sue for an invasion of privacy, even though the information is true. If you feel that it's so sensitive that it invaded your privacy, you could sue, and some people do collect. It's hard, especially hard against the press because of the First Amendment to collect for invasion of privacy. But there are also some new laws that give us assistance. We mentioned on the last show about the Privacy Act, which gives you right of access to government files. There is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which gives me a right to see either my credit bureau file or my insurance investigation file and to correct it if it's wrong. And I think that's a very important right. And one other, federal law gives me the right as a student to see my own school record.
So someone can validate the different information. And is there a problem there with who is assessing information? You know, like it's all right if you're able to correct your own, but if you don't know it's wrong, why should there be more regulation about who is in charge of the information?
Well, regulating the flow of information is a very tricky business, I think, because you don't want to get into the business of censorship.
Right.
I think that the best assurance is to let the individual who's in the field, they call a data subject, which is kind of an awkward term, but the individual who is the subject of the data. If he or she has the right to verify the information, I think that goes a long way, I think, towards assuring the integrity of the information.
Thank you.
I think Lou's question, it would be a good time to bring in another example of how information can be put in a file that is in error. In 1976, candidate Jimmy Carter found out that the Justice Department had in a file that in Sumter County, Georgia, there was a case of a black family that had a child that it was reported was being encouraged to be removed from the integrated school that he attended, and that Jimmy Carter had said if you don't remove him from school, you'll lose your right to be on the farm. This was all false and proved to be false, but only because that Jimmy Carter could get the information and check the witnesses and clear up that information. So my question is, it can be anyone in this country, could it not, that just rumors would be gathered and put in a file, and some might interpret those to be true unless you have some way of getting that information and being able to disprove it.
Absolutely. I think the Carter case is a very good example because that was raw information that the authorities knew was not accurate but were disinclined to destroy it. And he saved himself. That was not fatal to his campaign, as you imply, because he sort of had an advance word that he knew it was in the file. He could anticipate it, and he could anticipate preparing his rebuttal. And if we as consumers don't have that right, then we're really in a bad fix.
Ken Wright.
I'd like to probe in the area a little bit of some of the recent court decisions, and we've had one here in Idaho. Privacy of individuals, and that would include news reporters, and you've been one in the past, so you've got to have some strong feelings about this. You know, the news reporters have been nailed by some of the courts recently as having to disclose their sources of information. And do you think that this is a real invasion of their privacy, or does the public, does society have the right to know whether these people are putting out reliable information or whether they're printing gossip?
That's a good question, because I am on both sides of that issue as a privacy advocate and as really a press advocate. I feel, first of all, we ought to be clear that that is a professional right that they are asserting, and it is not a private right. They are not protecting personal information about themselves as individuals, and I view privacy as strictly an individual right. So it's a professional right that they are asserting, and they are saying that they need confidentiality as opposed to privacy. They need confidentiality to do their job under the First Amendment, and I think that's a compelling argument. I think that the state has to have awfully strong cause to compel a reporter to reveal his sources. I think that the case in New Jersey runs a little bit counter to that. Here was an individual on trial for murder. Here was information that the judge could have seen in camera, in secret. It didn't have to be disclosed, and I think that the reporter's position was less defensible in that particular instance. So it's a balance, and I think that for the state to break down that confidentiality, it has to have an awfully strong interest.
What's your feeling about the general drift of these court decisions? Do you think they've been good for the news?
No, they haven't been good for the news media at all, but I can understand the court's reasoning behind them. Many of them have been based on very technical legal reasons, and which I really support. I think that the Stanford Daily decision can be understood in context of legal development. I am much more concerned about the court's development of privacy law. Development's the wrong word. It's diminution. I mean, they are really, I think, diluting the right to privacy. It is a constitutional right. It is recognized as such because of several constitutional amendments. But the recent court under Justice Rehnquist, the youngest member of the court, he'll be with us for some time, is taking a very narrow view of the right to privacy, saying you have a right to privacy, a constitutional right, only when it is something involving marital activities or the raising of your children or very intimate sexual activities. And I think there are many other aspects of our personal life that are deserving of protection.
Would you take just a moment? I think the viewer's wondering about what those are. Would you give a few examples of areas where you feel that you have a right to privacy that the court is not protecting at this time?
Financial affairs. I mean, I could think of certain things about my income or how I spend my money, if in the hands of the government, would invade my constitutional right to privacy. I think that extramarital sexual activities are deserving of a right to privacy. Everybody has a gut feeling about that certainly sexual activities, whether or not within the marital bedroom, are entitled to protection of the right to privacy. But the court doesn't see it that way. They have really restricted it to marital affairs. I think that's a good example. A federal employee has a right of privacy in certain aspects of his professional life. I don't think it's right to disclose his medical record, for instance, and if the government were to do that, I think that would violate his constitutional right to privacy.
Richard Snyder.
I'm sitting here thinking about trust, and I'm wondering how this kind of surveillance, data gathering, and storing attitudes about prying into other people's lives, what's that doing to our national sense of trust? For instance, Watergate might be an example. But how do you suppose I'm going to feel walking away from here knowing that 5 years of my life is sitting in computers in various handy places around the United States? You know, what's this going to do with my sense of trust? How am I going to go out and look at the businessman down the street, you rotten so-and-so, the businessman, not you. Do you know of anything that's going on in the United States that's eroding away trust, anything like that?
I think you're right. Many people say, well, I have nothing to hide, and what's the big danger? I've never been denied a job because of anything in the files, and I think the real danger is just exactly what you say. It's a reduction in trust among people. It increases suspicion. It leads people to believe that all sorts of files are kept on them by some big brother way off, and so they better keep their nose clean. They better be very cautious in their behavior. I think that's the real cost, the social cost that we're paying right now. because it is a trend and it is a threat. It's not an actual problem that affects many, many, many people. It affects only a few people, but I think the trend affects all of us. But then again, you know, I think I could accurately be accused of lessening trust, because I say that you can't trust all those people with all this information about you, which many people would regard as very innocuous. And I'm always pointing out what can go wrong. And so people could accuse me, I guess, of lessening trust.
Another thing I was thinking about was proxemics, the use of space, for instance, human space. Is banning smoking in a public place an invasion of my privacy or protection of somebody else's privacy? Anything going on with, I'm not asking you to take a stand for or against smoking in public places. Is my right to space being invaded, not only by increasing population, but by the government?
I kind of anticipated that with an anthropologist on the panel we would get a question like that, and it's an awfully fascinating area that I like to get into. Suffice it to say that the more crowded the planet becomes, the more we're going to have to face these questions, clearly. I mean, and I think that part of the tension in our society is that we are running out of elbow room. Now, it may not be evident in North Idaho, I don't know, but certainly in the East Coast, you do feel that lack of physical privacy, that lack of elbow room that is so necessary to people. I've heard the smoking question argued both ways, and let me beg the question, because it affects people's privacy both ways. It affects their autonomy, it affects their freedom.
Along the same line, you might talk some more about the conflicts, potential conflicts between freedom of speech and the right to privacy. One that comes to mind is telephone sales, and I know that certain states probably have rules, have laws governing this. Is this something that actually, do you feel that there is a freedom of speech issue involved in the telephone sales?
Well, it is certainly projected as such by merchants who want to use the telephone to sell a product. And they are right to a certain extent that their free speech is covered by the First Amendment, but the courts have recognized that commercial speech is on a much lower plane. Political, social speech does have a very strong constitutional underpinning, but commercial speech, advertising has less. The state of Oregon, I believe, does regulate billboards, for instance, right? Now that's a censorship of a sort, and I think the same analogy would apply to uphold regulation of use of the telephone. What really worries me is automated use of a telephone to sell products. There's been some of that in California and other states now, where the computer will dial up the phone and beam a recording at you, and to add insult to injury, it won't hang up when you hang up. You can pick up the phone later to call out, and if the message is still going on, you'll still get it.
Well, in general, what do you think the state of the Bill of Rights is right now in the country, even though there are obviously these conflicts that are building?
Well, I think the freedom of speech and press is much stronger than it was maybe 10 years ago, 7 years ago, certainly stronger than it was in the 50s. I think the right to privacy is severely diminished by the threat in the private sector, the threat of automation, by the threat of big government, and by the threat of a Supreme Court that really takes a very constricted view of this. So I think in my field, the right to privacy, which is based on the Bill of Rights, is really in jeopardy right now.
Ken Wright.
Bob, you've been the assistant director of a project for the American Civil Liberties Union in the recent past. Have you ever gotten involved with the rights of inmates of institutions, government, either federal or state institutions?
Just on the periphery, with regard to privacy rights, I have very few. I think that the right to open up mail of prisons, for instance, has been upheld. The state may do that, I believe.
I just wondered what your feelings were about the rights of inmates, particularly in penal institutions, right not to be searched or this sort of thing. You have any feelings that the government's gone way overboard and violating these people's personal rights?
I don't have that notion. I do know, and many scholars, because of their studies of penal institutions, sort of back this up, that is the place to look if you want to see what happens when privacy is totally invaded. I think that half of the punishment of incarceration is not the lack of freedom, the bars, but the lack of privacy. And there is none. You are a number, too. You are totally a number. You have no identity. You are stripped of your clothing. You are stripped of your private little space where you can have your own little trinkets and all of that. You have no privacy for bodily functions. So that's the place to look if anybody wants to know what happens when society strips away privacy.
You think it's all right in the case of penal institutions? Do you think it's necessary?
Oh, a lot of it's necessary, certainly. I mean, you do have to search the comings and goings of prisoners, and I think it's proper to search large packages. I don't think that mail ought to be read. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court will allow searches of envelopes, but I don't think it's proper nor legal to read the mail that comes and goes.
A former congressman from California, John Moss, did a rather thorough investigation of this question of phones and modern technology in that. I would like to ask you really a broad question based on that investigation about telephones and the whole question of bugging, not only wiretapping and eavesdropping from a particular building, but also being off at a distance with modern technology and being able to pick up conversations in a building you're not even in. How serious is this area of advanced technology invading even the privacy in the home, and are there any serious abuses at this time?
Well, the device that you mentioned that will overhear conversations from across the street is kind of big in Europe. It's not big here, and it's still in the testing stage, but I think the concept is a sound one. It probably just has to be made more sophisticated. It can detect vibrations on the window pane of a hall in which, say, I was speaking. My voice would make minor vibrations that a microwave or a laser, I'm not sure which, would detect and then translate back into the sounds of my voice for somebody across the street. I mean, the implications of that are immense. Also, another device that was developed by CVS Labs, which is sort of the opposite of a directional mic, which will pick up sound in any place in the room. CVS Labs has a directional speaker that will direct speech to only one place in the room, and that has amazing implications to me, not maybe privacy, but certainly in the way of propaganda. Imagine the insecurity if you can, of a person, if they know that a message can be beamed to them, but nobody else, and they think everybody's getting the same message. It has remarkable implications, as does a lot of these other technological gadgets.
We know from reports we get from inside the Soviet Union, from people there, that these kind of gadgets are supposedly used for people in their apartments, wherever they are. In this country, as we have more advancement of that kind of technology, will it not require more legislation and a very dedicated U.S. Supreme Court to prevent the misuse of such technology?
I would agree with the latter about the Supreme Court. I may surprise you when I say I'm not a particular advocate of legislation because I have seen how regulation just, first of all, can be circumvented so easily, but secondly, the technology seems to beat it so quickly. My preference would be that the technology would catch up with the abuses and take care of the problem as opposed to legislation. Good example was Lou's comment about telephone sales. Now about a dozen states have prohibited those devices. But the technology will find a way around that. Instead, why not have the technology be used for our advantage to overcome that? A couple of examples come to mind. Bell Laboratories is now experimenting with what they call a do not disturb signal, which is different from a busy signal and different from a ring. And it would, through a mini computer in the telephone, simply take down the number that is calling us and indicate to the caller that we just don't want to be disturbed right now, and then we can call back at our leisure. There is another device that, with a mini computer, you could program into it all of your friends' phone numbers, so that when your friends call, you get a ring, and when strangers call, you get a buzz or something else. And I think that'd be very effective. And we would know, you wouldn't have to run out of the bathtub. If you got a buzz, you'd know that was a stranger. But if you got a ring, that was a friendly call. And if technology can, be used for us, it'd be great.
Good point. Richard Snyder.
What about a lie detector? How does that fit in?
I want to ask you that. I mean, as an anthropologist, do you think that there are bodily changes that would betray in me whether I'm telling the truth?
Yes.
Really?
Sure.
And you think they can be picked up with an electronic device?
Yes.
Really?
I can't guarantee the accuracy.
Oh, well, that's important. I mean,
Emotional states, to my knowledge, do change bodily functions.
okay. But will you stress? I will admit that stress in me will be shown in perspiration and a few other things that can be picked up with a device. But is stress equated with dishonesty? Is that an equation? And I think that's the assumption that a lie detector works on, I think. That stress can be detected in me through changes in my body. I mentioned the one in perspiration. There are others, heartbeat, blood pressure. And that shows stress, and I accept that, but I don't accept the notion that stress betrays dishonesty.
So, but I wasn't asking you whether they work.
Okay.
I was trying to find out if you think that's an invasion of privacy.
Yeah, I do. Even if they work, especially if they work, I do. The warm-up questions get into very sensitive areas as a way to gauge sort of normal embarrassment levels, drug use, sexual activities, things like that are nobody else's business. Mainly, you know, they purport to detect what's going on in there, and if that's not private, nothing is. That's what's in your head. Your beliefs, I think, are sacrosanct and are nobody's business. And any device that purports to do that, I think, invades my privacy.
Another thing that just came to mind: alcohol tests out on the road by state troopers, etc. And if my memory serves me correctly, in Idaho, you have the right to refuse to take the test, and then comes catch-22. If you refuse it, the state can take your driver's license away. Isn't that A, invading privacy, and B, forcing that invasion on me?
I would say if the officer had some sort of probable cause of suspicion, then it would invade my privacy, but be a necessary invasion. One thing about that system, I think that in accepting the license, you sort of accept that condition to drive on the highway. In other words, I think the motorist is informed beforehand that that's one of the ground rules. And so I sort of give my implied consent to that.
So you don't see that as an invasion of privacy?
Well, I do, but I have sort of given my consent, which would obviate the privacy invasion.
But
With that, I have to interrupt. I'm sorry, Richard, but the clock has caught up with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program for the past 2 weeks with Mr. Smith and this very important discussion about your privacy. Thank you for being with us. It's been most informative.
I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Hope you'll be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart. Have a good week.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.